Ladies and gentlemen, good evening again. Thank you for being here. As I've thought about the role of religion in world affairs in the last few years, one of the most persuasive areas to me in which one can see the impact of religion on the world is in the area of development and humanitarian assistance. In my research, I've bumped into a couple of wonderful people who you get the chance to meet and hear from tonight. I was involved in public policy for about 35 years in the Washington, D.C. area and have a very pronounced feel for the standoffishness of the system, the bureaucracy, the culture when it comes to thinking of religion as having a place, an active place in policy consideration. It was very, very enlightening for me to read about the aha moment, if you will. If I can call it that, you'll correct me if I'm not correct, Catherine. That the World Bank had back around 1999. James Wolfenson was president of the World Bank at the time. The millennium was approaching, Millennium Development Goals were under discussion, and the way I read it, somebody somewhere realized, that organizations working from the faith-based perspective probably do as much, or I should say probably a heck of a lot more development than the World Bank ever has. Is that overstating it? But the idea that there were people out there, organizations in the world, think about it, healthcare, education, poverty, shelter. From reading what you write, 75% of the hospitals in Uganda are owned or operated by mosques and churches. And again, this statistic, it's rough order of magnitude stuff here. Catherine has a very precise mind. My memory is very selective. But the point being that without understanding and being able to coordinate with those faith-based institutions out there very active in the world, the World Bank felt it was missing a few pistons. Some of the pistons weren't hitting. So around that time, Wolfenson decided to ask Katherine Marshall to establish and stand up an office at the World Bank, the purpose of which was to engage with the world's religions. And that's, again, think of that as accurate in rounded terms. But it's been that recent and of that nature that the realization has come that there is a role that happens out there. And I started thinking about it that, when the budgets go south, the NGOs go away, the government agencies get scarce, but the churches and the mosques are there. And when the conflicts happen, again, the wars start and the bullets fly, the consistency, the continuity of those kinds of providers, again, is an important part of the picture. So I hope I've given you, just by dose here and dose there, a feel for the significance of this discipline and of its role in the overall picture of religion and world affairs. In the past few years, I've gotten to know Sharon Eubank and Katherine Marshall. Sharon has been introduced to you as the director of LDS Charities. Charities. I almost said philanthropies. They're close. Sharon had a career in Washington, D.C. on the U.S. Senate staff and also a career in private business before becoming involved in the LDS Church's efforts in this. It's about a 30-year-old effort that the LDS Church has been, actively leaning forward in its seat, trying to carve out a role in humanitarian assistance. It's neat to think of a young faith tradition like Mormonism working in an area that is as large and as complex as that. And I think Sharon and her experiences in the Middle East has played a large part in your experience. Is that correct?
It is.
It's an interesting thing to think of the initial trajectory of this effort and Sharon representing that effort, that focus, and that energy. Katherine Marshall is the premier authority, certainly in the United States, and one of the premier authorities in the world on the subject of religion and development. She has moved the effort to the Berkley Center at Georgetown. and now the World Faiths Development Dialogue is housed there. And it's really one of the exciting things you can do on the internet is to go to the Berkley Center and go to the WFDD and start looking at interviews. There was a Cambodia portal, Bangladesh portal. I mean, all of these different countries where there are just scores and scores of interviews with people in a very real setting talking about development from a faith-based perspective. I hope that's a sufficient introduction, and we're very, very happy to have both of you here. One of my dreams was to see these two women connect, and it happened in Istanbul last November, and this moment was birthed back then, so we're very happy to have you here.
We're lucky, we feel it.
Tonight we're going to handle this as a kind of a conversation. I've got a few questions that I may or may not use, but we'll interrupt now and again to ask you any question or any reaction from your part to what we've been talking about. There are issues out there in the areas of development and humanitarian assistance. How do you deal with corruption? Corruption, one of the great challenges that is faced, and do faith-based players have a thought or a say-so in that? I think we'll get round to that, but let me start off this conversation by asking Katherine, first you and then Sharon, if you would, why do you do this? What is it, either out of your own experience or your own thought processes, that makes you want to be involved in this work at this time?
Well, let me start with the issue of injustice and inequality. And I think there is no challenge in the world, and no moral challenge and no practical challenge that is as great as the misery of people who live in abject poverty, who live in situations of conflict, and something that is completely unavoidable in today's world, which is the inequality. I mean, we have many stories, and we could spend the whole night telling stories, but I will tell you one that has never left my mind, that I was responsible for the Sahel department in the World Bank, which was 10 countries in West Africa, and was visiting Niger, which at the time had 22% only children in primary school. And we had a $200 million IDA grant all ready to go, but there was a teacher strike and political problems. But we went to visit a school where there were 120 children in a class sitting on the ground with no books, nothing. And they were the lucky ones, because they were the ones who at least had some opportunity. But I went home, and my son at the time was about 3 years old, and I went to look at one of the schools that he would go to. And they were debating whether computers in the classroom was a good idea, and whether 14 children was too many, and there was color and light. And it affirmed something that goes way back in me, that there's just no way that this is right and just, and that our challenge is to give everyone the opportunity to develop their God-given gifts, and to do something about these injustices in the world.
Thank you. Sharon, tell us, if you don't mind, a bit of your story.
Well, I really resonate with what Katherine just said, this idea of allowing what is the human potential in each person to kind of grow up and flower, and there's so many barriers in the world. Let me just tell a story. It isn't why I'm in this industry, but it's a good example. When ISIS came out of Raqqa, where it was, and it headed toward Mosul, down in Iraq, and that's a city of 1 million people, and they persecuted the Christians, and not only the Christians, but you had a mass movement of people who had nowhere to go except for the Kurdish border. And so you've got a decision right there, because that autonomous region is protected by a National Guard, and their decision was, do we let these people in over our border, knowing that they might destabilize and that they don't speak our language and they often come from a different religion, and oh, by the way, Saddam persecuted us, and this is one of the cities that was one of the greatest persecutors of the Kurds. And so their government had to make a decision in that very moment, do we let them over the border and come in? They did make the decision to do that. And so they tried to vet, but they opened up their border knowing that this was going to destabilize the situation that they had. And a lot of those Christians came into the capital city of Erbil, and they congregated at the Anglican church. So the vicar of Baghdad, who runs that church, it's a large complex, it's walled. Suddenly he has, in one day, 5,000 of these refugees that have come up from these horrific experiences, and he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to feed them. They have come with nothing, and every 2 minutes, cars are pulling up, with more people. And so there were some Christian communities. This was the Christian Quarter, and the LDS Charities office happened to be across the street. And the vicar of Baghdad walked across the street, and he said, I got to have some help. He said, is there anything you can do for me? And they said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, the first thing is I don't know how to feed people. And so they started working together. And so you've got the mayor of Erbil, and you've got the vicar of Baghdad, you've got the LDS charity guy who's a real estate agent, from Salt Lake City. But they started working together just to solve this problem about food for the night. And as they worked together in that situation, the horrific stories were coming up about women with their little toddlers that had just seen all the men in their family massacred in front of them, and just knowing all of those kinds of things. I'm telling you this story because it's something I've personally experienced. So I've gone back to them, back and forth. The vicar of Baghdad has come to Salt Lake to talk about that warm relationship when you've gone through something terrible like that, and set aside whatever differences you have to work together for the potential that exists in people's hearts. It has the potential to bond you in a way that nothing else does. And I know this situation is real because I lived through that, and it's still continuing to go on. And that is the reason that I'm doing this. I'm an addict. That thing, it exists because there's so many barriers that it shouldn't exist, and yet when it does, when it actually happens, to me that is more powerful than a drug. And to save the rising generation in those ways and their human potential, to me it's just a privilege to be part of. And it wakes me up every morning.
Thank you. The idea that faith-based effort has a proper role or an impactful role to play in development and humanitarian assistance, again, it isn't instinctive, I would think, for an audience like this or an American audience. And some might even think it's kind of un-American to try and put religion in the front lines or actively involved in that. But let me ask each of you, what is it that faith brings to a development situation or humanitarian assistance situation? What is valid and effective and impactful about faith-based effort being involved there?
Well, I think there are at least two sides to it. One is the world's population, and then the other is this complex issue that you started in asking us, which is about motivation and drive. The sort of no-brainer on the faith issue is the estimates that we're using are 84% of the world's population belongs to one faith tradition or another. They have some faith affiliation. That's a pretty large group of people, and it is an enormously important part of people's lives. And how much it's changing, we're not sure. In other words, some people say there's a resurgence of faith, we're not sure. But certainly it is a vital part of people's lives, and it's simply foolish to ignore that part of it. It is, though, ferociously complex. And I discover new traditions virtually every day. And when Jim Wolfenson launched this initiative in the World Bank, he's quite proud of saying that of 184 member countries of the World Bank, it was 184 to 0 for the World Bank getting involved. And we needed to spend quite a lot of time trying to figure out what the problem was. And essentially, the view was that you shouldn't touch religion because it's divisive, it's political, it's against a lot of the principles of development, like gender equality. It's not really that important anyway in the modern world, so you basically had a whole set of those arguments which have their counter. But the fact is that most development, well, I say we work on issues now that from AIDS to zebras. In other words, pretty much any development issue, I challenge you to ask me about an issue, energy access or whatever, and I'll find the religious dimension. Because there are religious dimensions to every single issue on the planet. The question, though, is trying to find to understand it within the context of the very different religious traditions. So I think that just the fact of life, of the importance of religions, religious beliefs, religious communities, religious practices within the human families, and including those that are the poorest and those in conflict areas, is vitally important. I think the issue of the motivation within the faith-inspired organizations and the somewhat complex issues of state and church or religion and governments is important. And I know that I think that it's very dangerous to assume that faith is the only motivation that can give people passion and caring for people. It's something you have to watch out for. And I also think that in thinking about these questions of poverty and the role of religion, your personal belief is much less important than the belief of the people who you're trying to work with. And that's a balance that people need to keep in mind. But it is obviously true that people are driven and motivated to care and to keep the balance of values by the teachings of their religious traditions. And that plays a very important role, and in fact, I think always has, in the way people think about development, whether you're looking at Dag Hammarskjöld or Truman or whatever. It's been an integral part of the evolution of approaches towards development, I think, from the beginning.
Thank you. Sharon, any thoughts along those lines from your experience?
You said something interesting about, especially in America, there's some question of should religious thought be part of the equation. And I really think that although there was not a desire to have a state religion in the United States, the whole system of democracy is based on moral values and people being willing to adhere to those moral values in some kind of way, and some kind of forum to be able to discuss what we have in common, and can we agree on certain values that we do have in common. I believe that, and no question coming from my background, religion has a place not only because 85% of the people adhere to some kind of religion, but it is an accelerator either for good or for bad. And you see this sometimes in religious conflict when people have very entrenched beliefs and they are reinforced by what they assume is a religious sanction. Things can go bad really fast. But on the flip side of that, if people are driven by their faith, their belief, and their openness to respect other people's faith and belief, it's an accelerator toward things like forgiveness and tolerance, and it allows things to happen that would take, in a secular situation, years, even decades to happen. Let me give a couple of examples. One of them is an old example. It happened after World War II. The Netherlands was completely decimated by German aircraft there, and the city of Rotterdam was carpet bombed in a way to break the Dutch spirit. So they had very strong feelings. Of course, people collaborated and people resisted, and anyway, when the Germans pulled out, they stole everything. Food, furniture, they just wiped the earth clean as they were leaving. So the Dutch have very strong feelings about this. Dutch government gives everybody seed potatoes, and they ask after the war, try and grow these in window boxes, and because they're facing a winter of starvation. And so Dutch communities started to do that. Well, there were some religious communities that were in touch with their sister organizations in Germany, which was also decimated by the war. And as it came up, there was this idea, maybe we should give these potatoes that we've been growing all summer to the Germans. And the answer was, no, we are not doing that. I mean, obviously, they would never do this to these bitter enemies. But as this council worked and discussed with this, the idea was they are starving in a worse situation than we are, and can we live our Christian religion and donate this? And the answer was, no, we're not doing this. But over the weeks as they discussed this, in the end they decided, and I think they sent 74 truckloads of potatoes over the border into the Germans. Now, this is a nice Christian act, and it's a story in that way, but that one thing, it healed the feelings, the bitterness of these enemies between themselves, because the Germans couldn't believe that the Dutch had done this thing. So you could have had meetings and conferences and all this discussion and peace building, but it takes an act like that within 1 year to heal things that would have not been healed in a secular setting in a long way. So there's an example. And there's a similar example in, I think it was in 2006 when the school shootings that happened in that Amish town, I think it was called Nickel Mines or something, and that Amish community rallied around the perpetrator's family. They went to his funeral. They invited the family there, and they just refused to have that be divisive in their community, and that did more healing than anything that could have happened. And so I'll go into communities, you go into communities, and they'll start with 168 years ago this thing happened, and then their list of grievances by that. And I think there are examples, powerful examples of faith traditions that have leaped over secular conventions and allowed something to accelerate in a positive way. In the negative side too, but certainly there are examples on the positive side.
I might ask a research question here that, Katherine, might be more up your alley, but it's something that kind of watched from a bit of a distance in your work. Simply the idea of trying to map where and what has been done by faith-based organizations, or is being done by faith-based organizations. I understand there's been both the Luce Foundation, the Gates Foundation, literally years of virtually a global effort. What can you tell us based on that experience, just simply trying to map out the efforts of the role of faith-based organizations in development?
Well, when we started trying, first of all, to persuade people that this was a really important issue, that they ought to take seriously within the development community broadly, one of the things that we faced was that there was it was not only that there was very little information, but that it was actively contradictory. I mean, one figure that I use that I'm aware of is the estimate of the share of health care provided by religious organizations in Africa. Those estimates range from 7 to 70%. And I mean, that's an awfully wide range. And people like Ban Ki-moon sort of, in fact, the German minister last week, I was furious, sort of says it's 45%, which we know is not true. So one of the first things we realized was that we had given the complexity to try to establish the factual basis of what was happening, and we use the word mapping, which I call journalistic mapping, because I think journalists are trained in, you have to ask who, what, where, why, when, how much, for what purpose. I mean, basically that's the first stage. But it's a very serious issue. I mean, most recently we're working on a case study of the role of religious groups in the Ebola crisis in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And we were aware that religious groups were running a lot of hospitals, and they were taking care of orphans, and they were getting sick and dying, and it was obvious. Then you had the issue of burial practices, where a lot of the disease was spread by touching bodies, which were obviously involved the religious leaders. So the first thing we said is, well, look, let's find out who are the religious groups that are involved. And there was absolutely no solid information on those countries for the governments or the WHO or anybody to rely on. So a first step is really just trying to establish what the situation is, and that's what we've invested at the Berkley Center and at WFDD a lot of time. The other experience, let me just sort of touch on this, is that I also am old enough that I have lived through there being no women in any of these professions except as the secretaries. And when people first started talking about gender, women, that was important, people used to giggle. You wouldn't get any men coming into the room. It was really taken as a completely non-serious subject, in frankly, not dissimilar way as religion. And the way that changed was with evidence, with knowledge and evidence of what was happening. And the classic example is the benefits of girls' education, which are fully and incredibly creatively documented. There are correlations between a mother's level of education and a child's head size because of the benefits of nutrition. So this issue of girls' education transformed Larry Summers and other people like that. So because the reactions to religion are not dissimilar, people's reactions to religion can be very emotional. They may not be dealing with their full brains. They may be dealing with their own experience. I think, like gender, which I think the issues of gender are the same, having this solid basis of knowledge and evidence and where are the complexities, what is the experience, is absolutely critical. And I think that for students this is one of those topics as important as in water supply or as important as in understanding a conflict is really asking yourself what is the religious composition, what's the history, how does it work, even what are the authority structures, et cetera. The evidence base is vital to be able to take the next steps.
Thank you. Sure, Sharon, any thoughts on your...
Well, I wonder if you'd just allow me to actually make this a conversation, because as a faith-based organization, I would love to know, what advice do you have about participating in that kind of mapping so that we do get some kind of evidence base? What advice would you give us in that way?
Well, it can't be done without engagement, but there are many different kinds of mapping. And it's sort of, we started out actually with a very global sweep, sort of, okay, Africa, what's the situation in Africa? What is known about religious demography? What's known about religiosity? Who are the main leaders, et cetera? But then we realized that until you actually get to the country level, it doesn't make much sense. Some people are doing very creative work with GIS, where they're actually sort of saying exactly where are the buildings and the clinics and the schools. There, I think the key thing is who's going to use it and for what. And that's where there has to be absolutely local ownership.
That's true.
But the knowledge, one of the issues is the knowledge is all over the place. I mean, why do you have the 7 to 70%? It's partly because people make up numbers, which does happen. It's also that people extrapolate falsely. And in the case of the health facilities, they extrapolate from a few countries they know well to the whole continent, which is what gets you into trouble. So there's some work that you can do just from 30,000 feet, but basically the real knowledge of who's doing what and what are they learning has to come from an active engagement and a sense that it's going to be used for something. Just doing it in the abstract doesn't really do much good except as a demonstration.
Is there any global body who's actually keeping track of that? Maybe it's the Berkley Center.
Nope. No. The answer is no. There are centers, but I mean we're doing our best. But I mean the German government, that last week they've announced they're going to create a knowledge center, but I'm not quite sure how much they're going to put into it and what will be in the knowledge center. The Dutch had a knowledge center at one point. But I mean to show you how bad it is, the World Bank for a long time, and I suspect it's still true, though I haven't checked in the last couple of years, there was no section in the library for religion.
Interesting.
Faith. It was just not part of the mental mapping. And UNESCO doesn't do it, so.
Let's take a pause here and just think of this. Okay, now turning to you as students, I think what we're about to talk about is kind of a primer in real politics. Because, as pointed out, there was a time in the World Bank when the president of the World Bank thought this was a very important thing. About 5 years later, the next president of the World Bank ashcanned the office and the whole initiative. Could you just let's just talk for a minute about the ups and downs, the difference between persons being interested, whether it's a minister of health or a president of a World Bank, and an interest and a capability being institutionalized. So I think this strikes at something, Sharon, situations that you face. Just could you talk for a minute about it, and then if we could bounce back to you, Katherine.
Well, Katherine will have something very specific and interesting about the World Bank, but one thing I was thinking about in preparation of coming here is, in everybody's conscious mind, no matter what faith tradition you come from, you are going to be aware of these huge world figures that have transcended into everybody's consciousness. Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Pope Francis, and these are people that because of their work, it's influenced other people and it's just transcended into the popular culture, and people know about that. And one of the questions I have is, what is it about them and their charisma and their vision and everything that they were able to do that, and yet the work continues? Or maybe it doesn't continue. But how do you get that, capitalize on that transcending into our consciousness? How can we actually build upon that work of these great, religious thinkers who have transcended into everybody's consciousness, and it doesn't just die with them? And how do you continue to go that on? We face these kinds of things. A pope changes and the agenda changes, or organizations change. And so I'm concerned a lot about in my faith-based organization, because maybe I'll only work here for 10 years. And what will be the legacy that will be consistent over 50 years' time or 75 years' time? And so we're interested in thinking about those kinds of things as an organization, how to structurally put those things in place so that they're not dependent on the leader or the personal interest or the charisma, some of those things.
Well, that's partly why I emphasized before this question that it's not about what the person who's the leader believes, it's about the issue, the importance of the issue. And I think there are at least two things that I feel very strongly about. One is that this question of what we're calling religious literacy, that people who are working in development, and I don't care what their religious tradition is, ought to have some basic understanding of the way that the religious landscape works in the country that they're working on. So I think that is absolutely critical. And secondly, I think that it should not be acceptable for people to say, as I've heard people, actually I had I'll mask the person, but I was talking about global education. There's a big commission, and I was urging someone to look at the role of education, religious education, including, of course, delivery, whether it's the Catholic system or madrasas or whatever, but it's also the questions of how religion is treated in the public curriculum, the question of how you're thinking about values and ethics. And the person said, well, if religion, and I said, there's some countries where religious groups are running 50% of the system. He said, that's the definition of a failed state. And this is a senior policymaker. So my point is that it should be unacceptable for someone to say, I don't want to have to deal with religion because I don't believe it's important. So that, I think that's the literacy, and making it clear that in the same way that it's not acceptable to say, I don't like women, and I don't want to deal with women in development, it should not. The same is true in terms of religion. Now, at the moment, you're still at the stage where this is something that is considered new and a bit risky, because we all know, you're not supposed to talk about religion at the dinner table, and it's not been part of the training. And so you do have this yo-yo situation where you have somebody who comes in who thinks this is very important and sets up a unit, and their successor says, well, I'm not going to do what my predecessor did, and I don't think this is a priority. I have 4 other priorities. And we've seen this in the World Bank. We've seen it in several UN agencies, and I've seen it in several European governments where there's been an initiative which has then basically been cut back because the successor didn't think it was their priority. So if we were able to get to the point where it was established enough, where it was clear that this is objective, it's not being run by a religious agenda, it's being run by what is best for fighting poverty, improving the environment, making peace, that then you would get to a point where it would not be a yo-yo, where somebody brings it in and brings it out. But I think people like you need to bring that sense that this is a core, central part of studying about development, about peace, about the environment, about any topic that you should be asking yourself, where does the religious factor come in?
Well, let's see if we can take that last point and vector it towards a current issue. The refugee crisis, I know it's been talked about quite a bit in several of the roundtable groups today. Sharon, what's the answer to the question with respect to the refugee crisis? Where do religious groups fit in? What has your experience been, or what has your observation been about that?
Well, I mean, I'll just be honest. Religious groups are all over the map when it comes to this, and it's the same way everybody else is. But I'm interested in this idea of religious literacy and something that the Wheatley Institution or similar groups like this might do to sort of enlarge the conversation of what would it mean to have a religious standard of conduct. And as you engage in an issue like refugees, what would be the credible kinds of guidelines that you might try to work for in those situations so that it is balanced and tolerant and it's more about them than it is about you, and just some of those kinds of things. It truthfully just doesn't exist. There are 100 different approaches and 100 different ways and varying degrees of credibility and success.
Interesting. Any thoughts out there on the topic? I mean, you are the literate generation in the room right now. Anybody here that would like to comment on the question of religious literacy? Do you feel religiously literate? Do you feel you'd be in a position to land in an airport in a country that's got an Ebola crisis going down, and you would be able to understand how to work in a circumstance like that? Go ahead, identify yourself and just wait for the mic.
I'm Robert Salmon. I'm from Utah State, and a religious studies major up there. This is actually my first semester. And from the first introductory courses I've taken, my mind has been expanded to see the different amounts of religions that they're out there. Now, you can't say that all Jews believe this or all Muslims believe this. They all believe and practice something very different. And so for someone to go and land in an area and say, I know exactly what, it'd be so difficult without fully, like Catherine said, getting to know like who's behind the things and more diving deep into what particular practice it is. And so that's why I was curious. I wrote down, because I'm in the development roundtable, of kind of introducing a policy to try and get religious studies to get that more literate in like a public school, to get people just a foundational knowledge of that. So that's just a thought I've had.
Interesting. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Please, over here. Maybe we'll just take one more comment and then spin forward. Freddie, sorry, we'll keep.
Hi, my name's Annie. I'm a student at the University of Michigan. And I just wanted to say, from when I was about in high school, I had a class where I was introduced to world history, and a lot of that incorporated religion and lots of different kinds of religions, obviously Islam, and we talked a lot about Buddhism and Taoism and all that stuff.
Where were you in school?
Novi in Michigan. It was a public school.
Okay.
But I think that laid a really important foundation for me education-wise. I think I was a lot more open to other perspectives, regardless of my having a particular kind of faith or no faith or whatever the case may be. And I think reaching students at a young age is important, and just saying that there's lots of different options available for you and just in the world in general. So I think, because not everybody goes to college thinking, I want to study religion, but when you're introduced to it earlier on, you're more open to the idea of being more accepting.
Great. Thank you very much. Those are a couple of good comments. Maybe we can just kind of jump over a couple of things. Let me just ask you, so what are the hot button issues? I'm tempted to ask, so Catherine, where have you been the last 2 weeks? It's probably at least 4 different countries around the world, but just what is it in your experience right now? I mean, if you had to write a policy paper or a short memo saying, look, we've got this has just happened in Germany. Actually, talk about Germany. You were just in Germany. You had some really positive things to say about the interests of the new minister there, and just.
Okay. Well, the Minister of Economic Development in Germany is convinced that the religion is a vital issue for development and for diplomacy and for climate change, in other words, for the full gamut of issues. And they have therefore taken now, I think, 9 months doing an intensive review and consultation. And so last week in Berlin,
they is
it's
within
the German government.
But within the ministry. Again,
it's
not,
within
just
the
because
ministry.
one ministry believes it doesn't mean all ministries believe
No,
it. So
it is the ministry. But they had this launch of the initiative last week.
Okay.
And the but is that they also had political representatives there, people from the Bundesrat. So they clearly have done a lot of consultation within the German government. It's gone to to Merkel and so forth. And they also launched something that's a little bit less clear what it will actually do, but it's a partnership that involves several bilateral agencies and some UN agencies that is going to try to exercise some kind of leadership. I hesitate even to use the word coordination. But on the hot button issues, well, last week, again, it was striking being here this morning. I think it's one of the few meetings I've been in recently where I didn't hear much about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. But the entire meeting in Berlin was very much structured around the Sustainable Development Goals that were approved by the United Nations last September. They very much had that as their intellectual architecture and
the
framework.
successor generation of goals after
Right.
the Millennium Development Goals.
Right.
Is that right? Okay.
Right, and because there are 17 goals and 169 targets, which I think almost everyone recognizes is beyond the human mind to be able to keep constantly at the forefront, they essentially boiled it down to people, prosperity, peace, and planet. And one of the interesting things, though, that came out of that meeting, which is close to a hot button issue, not quite, is that these 4 issues are absolutely inseparable. In other words, that you cannot talk about conflict without really talking about development and the opportunity for people to have jobs and education. And you cannot talk about development any longer without talking about what's happening on the environmental front. And you cannot talk about any of these issues without thinking about the global economy. And so I think in that sense, I'm not even sure that that's what they thought they were doing. The way they structured it, it did bring very much to the fore the way in which we're living in such a complicated world with these interrelationships.
Okay, thank you. Sharon, any thoughts about hot button issues from your perspective?
Well, there is, the refugee crisis has sort of precipitated this idea, but the United Nations has basically said we weren't designed to handle the kinds of crises that are happening right now. Syria, Central African Republic, Sudan, they're all going on at the same time and they're lasting for years and years, and we weren't structured like this. We're not funded to handle these kinds of things. And so the General Secretary Ban Ki-moon has called what I think it's called the Global Humanitarian Summit. Very first one, it's going to be in Turkey in May. And they're trying to bring traditional people together, but they're trying to attract other groups that might be able to look at this problem and actually bring new money, new ideas, new innovation to the table. And I think this is an opportunity for what we're talking about today, because there's always been hesitation about involving faith-based groups for lots of different reasons. The hot buttons are proselytizing, gender issues, technical expertise, all these kinds of things. But I think there's a new interest being driven maybe by the refugee crisis and other things of trying to find out, can we deal with those in a credible kind of way that we can all at least agree on, so that we could actually use new money and new actors. There's really only, this is probably true, 7 or 8 funds that actually fund all of the development work in the world. And if you can attract something new to that really, it can change the game. So Ban Ki-moon and the people who are putting this on are trying to explore this idea in the global community, and it's a very interesting idea. There's lots of hot buttons involved in all of that, wrapped up in that. So that's something that I've been thinking about.
You know, I think it's probably a good moment to kind of again turn back to you guys. I think we've made pretty good use of this hour. I realize there's so much more to digest or to present and to digest than we possibly could handle here. Why don't we just go to the floor, take again a moment and start right here. Take the mic, identify yourself. Go ahead and stand if you would.
My name is Saba Yasmin. I'm from Rutgers University. One of the questions that I had, and I think this is, you guys work internationally, this is more of a United States question, but the homeless population in the United States tends to be, a majority of them are LGBTQ, and the people that they need help from are faith-based organizations. So how can faith-based organizations provide services to these homeless young people without sort of imposing on them?
Mm-hmm.
Sharon, do you want to grapple with that?
That's a very realistic, practical application. I'll just tell you a story. My youngest sister was in therapy, and so as part of therapy, my whole family went to therapy. And you know, she would give a version of something that was important to her, and we would all say, that's not really what happened. And the therapist finally took us aside and said, it doesn't really matter what your perspective is in this thing. This is her discussion, and so we need to look at things from her perspective. That's the only way that we can actually address this. And I really fought against that of, yes, but the reality, you know, is this. And the therapist finally just said, this is about her, it's not about you. And I think, you know, we've talked about that in a little ways. So to be able to provide from faith-based organizations, even to somebody who may be diametrically opposed to your faith position, if you are in that social realm, you have to have the skills of saying, this is about you, it's about your perspective, and you have a human right to be protected, to have shelter, to have food, you know, those kinds of things. And we're involved in this as a faith-based community because we have a commitment to basic human brother, sisterhood kinds of ideas. And so if you can't function on that kind of a level, if your commitment doesn't allow you to do that, then you probably don't belong in those kinds of social services in that kind of a way. That's not a very complete answer, but it's an approach anyway.
Let me just add to the brilliant answer two things. First, clearly there are many faith communities that have taken the LGBT cause as their social justice issue, and they're on the forefront of that issue. So it is another one, as you were saying before, where there are enormous divisions, and the idea of saying faith believes X or religion does Y is the first thing that's going to get you into trouble, because there's a guarantee that there are going to be different views and different interpretations. The second is that in terms of issues like homelessness or street children, I think it is the case where religious organizations are at their finest, and one of the challenges there is that we're not able to gather enough of the experience that to inform policy and to move things, and they're huge. I mean, just to take another issue that's a hot button issue at the moment is the question of orphanages, because if there's one thing that religious traditions come closer to in agreeing, it's that the care of vulnerable children is the absolute priority. And yet, there's been a tremendous amount of research and knowledge that shows that basically is pretty conclusive that orphanages are not the right way to take care of children in the 21st century, that very, very rarely is that the right thing, but you still have many, many religious traditions that are still building and creating and raising funds around orphanages. But you also have some of the best street children programs. So you need to sort of really appreciate the complexity, draw on the experience, both the good experience and the bad experience, and try to integrate that with some of the social science research and the knowledge that's coming from the broader community, so that we do solve these social problems that should be solvable in the 21st century.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question over from this side, please.
Hi, my name's Alicia. I study at Brigham University. And I have a question about the culture of religion and separation of church and state in the United States. And I think it will be difficult to find a group of students like this or adults that agree that religion and development need to be integrated, that we need to take a look at that. And I was wondering if there are any faith-based organizations that are working on that kind of a media outreach, a spread of ideas, or something to change that culture at a grassroots level. Are there any programs in place with that?
There's some great books. But there, and I'm actually going in a couple of weeks to the Religion News Writers meeting. So there's quite a lot of very creative media. I think, though, the point that was made earlier, that it is the universities that need to address the issue, but it's also high schools and even earlier, where we bring this topic of religion into the public discourse and discussion in a way that reflects the spirit of openness and tolerance, but also rigor. That you don't just accept that because it's religious it's good, or because it's secular it's bad, or vice versa, depending on your point of view. That you come with a curiosity, this fascination of learning about these different ways of looking at the world, raising the most fundamental questions, raising the question of what kind of world do we want to create. These are all embedded into this. So there are more and more universities that are trying to deal with this. I think there are even in the US some public school systems that are trying with some difficulty to have sort of study basic world religions programs, but there clearly needs to be a lot more.
Well, we've arrived at the 8:30 hour, and I know how much you're dying for dessert, which is going to be right next door. Is that right, Troy? The dessert reception. Maybe what we could do is just ask, I'll put it in the form of a question, but you can say whatever you'd want to give Sharon and Katherine the last word. But is there, if there were one success story, one accomplishment that captures for you the value of entertaining the complexity that you've talked about, pushing forward, notwithstanding the cultural barriers and sometimes legal and political barriers. You can end on a positive note, or perhaps if there is just one barrier that you wish you could remove, that one technical, political, cultural barrier that's made it hard for religion to have its impact in development.
Katherine will have a good answer to this, so I'm going to give a short answer first.
Okay.
Somebody made the comment, maybe you, about it made me think about the skills that are necessary to actually engage at the grassroots level in practical kinds of work. And as I think about what has been successful for me, or as I've seen of others, it has to do with this idea that no one way is right, that there are many options and we can be open to those options. I think it has to do with the curiosity of asking a lot of questions about why things are the way they are in this instance. And it has to do with the warmth or the ability to create strong relationships with people who feel differently than I do. And then maybe the fourth thing would be time. We talked at dinner as we were sitting there about it feels so discouraging to try and make progress and then to go backwards. But as you look over 40 years or 50 years, you can see the progress that is being made. And these kinds of things won't get solved with a bunch of projects, and they won't be forced into a timetable. But if you can cultivate the ability to ask questions, cultivate the ability to connect with people who feel very differently from you in a very sincere kind of way, give yourself the time that it takes and the ability to innovate and ask questions about why is this the way it is so that I can understand the core issues. To me, those are the skills that are behind this religious literacy. And you are the leaders. I'm going to be gone in 5 years. I'll retire and I'll go do something else that's not as complex. But you are these leaders that are coming up, and it gives me a lot of energy and hope to be in a room like you because you care about these issues, you're structuring your lives around these issues, your personal commitment, and the careers that you hopefully have. And so it's been a real pleasure for me to be with you, and I'm just so thankful for the Wheatley Institution and other, like the Berkley Center and other institutions that are creating the space for this kind of thought to exist.
Thank you, Sharon.
Well, Sharon said it all. So, but let me add one last issue, and then essentially make the same plea to you. In all the crises, you mentioned hot button issues. I think there are many people who feel that we are facing crises and challenges that we've not faced before. Mm-hmm. And as you say, there's so many of these conflict situations, so many of them unexpected, mm-hmm. and they don't end. And situations you thought were solved, the conflict erupts again. But in virtually every one of them, this broad term governance comes up. And it is an absolutely vital issue. And it is one that I think that the religious worlds need to be part of thinking about. And it is, you can't just dismiss governments as hopeless. We
Just
need government.
Take 15 seconds, just break it down. Governance, what do you mean? What are the issues implied in that term you use, governance?
Well, governance is code word for a lot of different things, including democracy, including efficient administration, and including corruption. But when people use the term governance, they basically mean the way that societies are governed by their political and their administrative institutions, whether it's their constitution or whatever. And in all of these situations, you're seeing a complete breakdown of governance. The specific issue of corruption is one that is a grievance in every single crisis situation that I can think of and that I know of. And I think that it is one that all of us should be putting our minds to, because it is something you can do something about. I mean, it's useful to remember that Boston and New York and perhaps even Salt Lake City went through periods of being rather corrupt, and these have been mastered. And it is one that affects all institutions, starting at the family and going all the way to the global society. And religious leaders and institutions have been surprisingly absent from a lot of the discussions about these issues for a variety of reasons. And I'd like to see them basically catapulted and forced into, first of all, one of the reasons is they're a bit uneasy about their own houses, so let's get the own houses, deal with that issue. But then really speaking truth to power, but also dealing with the practicalities of what it means. And I think that it extends beyond that to the basic responsibility of providing security for citizens and providing education and health and so forth. But Dick Ruffin is dealing with the thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of NGOs. I don't think that the solution to poverty and to conflict and so on lies with a myriad of thousand flowers. It has to be within some kind of a structure. And I think we need to find ways to work better within those structures, even as we challenge them. So the issue that we're looking for is indeed to have groups like you be the leaders in making this. There's one of my colleagues has an article she wrote, Religion, the New Normal, that it's not an exceptional issue. It's not one that is related to your personal beliefs, but that it is a fundamental part of understanding the world and engaging in it.
Interesting. Well, there you are. You guys, thank you very much. Let's give a hand to these two wonderful people.